afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for joining today's panel discussion. My name is Alyssa Haydari and I'm the Deputy Director of the IIP. The IIP provides a collaborative national platform that brings together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. This is the third and last event we're having in a series about wrongful convictions and exonerations. For those of you who weren't able to join us for the earlier events, they are posted on our website at a link that we will provide in a few minutes in the Q&A feature. So today, we're going to have what I expect to be a very moving and special presentation that we at the IIP are honored to be hosting. So much of the focus of exonerations tends to be on the accused person who is found innocent years after being sentenced to prison. And of course, there's very good reason for that, as those people have suffered tremendously. But what is often lost is the voices and needs of survivors who can be re-traumatized when they learn that the person who has been in prison, often for many years, is not in fact the person who they thought committed the crime, and that the actual perpetrator was never caught. And this news, if not delivered in a very timely and sensitive way, can cause confusion, fear, and immense grief. Exonerations also often force survivors to relive the trauma of the crime itself and to be publicly blamed for having played a role in the wrongful conviction. So today we are going to hear from three remarkable women. I'm so excited that they're here with us today, and they're working in this space to improve the experiences of survivors across the country, and they all have personal stories that can be an inspiration for all of us. And before I introduce our guests in more detail, I'd like to take time to read the IIP's Land Acknowledgement Statement. We acknowledge that the IIP and John Jay College are based in New York City, which is Lenapehoking, the Lenapeho land. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of the indigenous people. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built Manhattan during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. So it's now my privilege to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Jennifer Thompson is founder of Healing Justice, which provides support, reconciliation, and recovery in cases involving exonerations. Ms. Thompson founded Healing Justice based on her experience with a failed criminal justice process that sent Ronald Cotton, an innocent man, to prison and left the true perpetrator free to commit additional crimes. Jennifer and Ronald co-authored a joint memoir, Picking Cotton, a New York Times bestseller, which recounts their journeys and the tragedy that brought them together. Personally, I read this book in law school. It's an amazing book, so I encourage all of you to read it if you haven't already. Jennifer is a nationally recognized and award-winning advocate for criminal justice reform, and she served on the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. Katie Monroe is executive director of Healing Justice. Before joining Healing Justice, she served as senior advocate for national partnerships at the Innocence Project, where she worked to develop collaboration with other criminal justice stakeholders, including crime victims, police, and prosecutors. Before that, she was executive director at the Rocky Mountain Innocence Center and senior counsel at the Constitution Project and U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Katie has taught law school courses at both George Mason University and the University of Utah, and she has served on the board of directors for the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project and the National Innocence Network, as well as on the Victim Services Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Last but certainly not least, we have Andrea Harrison, who is a crime victim surviving family member, the youngest daughter of her slain mother, whose original case was overturned and the accused was exonerated. Through her experience with the justice system and victim support, Andrea has become an advocate for victims' rights, focusing on children whose parents have been victims of violent crime. She utilizes her personal platform to bring awareness to the need for victim and surviving children support by sharing her experience and providing scholarships to violent crime victims or their children who are pursuing a bachelor's degree. Andrea's stance is that victims and their families should stand up in bravery, speak out against injustice, and fight back to change the narrative of violent crime victimization and re-victimization in cases of exoneration. So thank you, all three of you, again, for being here today. Ms. Thompson, we're going to Start with you. You co-founded the Healing Justice, which stemmed from your own personal story as a rape survivor. And the person who was originally accused, convicted, and imprisoned, Ronald Cotton, was ultimately exonerated years later. Can you very briefly describe your experience just to give our audience a little bit of context of your story and your perspective?
Sure, and thank you so much, Alyssa, for inviting us to participate in today's presentation. And you know, it's interesting because most people are aware of my story, and so I don't want to dive too much into the actual rape in and of itself, because while that was a harmful part of my life and certainly incredibly traumatic, I really usually tell people that it's the post-exoneration experience that harmed me more than anything, to be honest with you. So in 1984, I was a college student. I had gone to bed that night and a stranger broke into my apartment around 3 o'clock in the morning and assaulted me at knife point in my bed. And throughout the assault, I tried really hardest to stay very focused and calm so I could pay attention to details that would help me, if I survived, aid the police in apprehending this person. I was able to escape after about 20 minutes and I survived the assault. The police were called. They tried to find him, and of course he had disappeared. And what we learned later is within an hour he raped a second woman less than a mile away from my home. But I was taken to the hospital where a rape kit was done, and then onto the police station to begin to gather my memory as a piece of evidence. And so I helped the police do a composite sketch. The composite sketch led to a suspect, which led to a photographic lineup and a physical lineup. And in both of those, I picked out a young man by the name of Ronald Cotton, which at that time I was told that I had done a great job. And so that led us, of course, to a trial in January of 1985 and 2 weeks of testimony and me being on the stand and recounting my experience over and over again. But at the end of the trial, Ronald Cotton was indeed found guilty of my rape and was sentenced to life in 54 years. And that's kind of what you're told is now the end, and you can begin to put your life back together again and move forward, and all the things we like to tell crime survivors that are inherently wrong, that it's now past you, and you move forward now, and you try and you attempt it, but it's just a fiasco. It's chaotic, it's confusing, you've been traumatized, you have PTSD, and there's really no place for crime survivors to begin to kind of work towards any type of healing in these processes. So 2 years later, the state appellate court overturned the decision, said that the jury should have known about this second survivor who had not made an ID, and so we now were going back to court. And again, that's very upending because I didn't understand that. I thought once a trial was over, it was over. And no one told me that there's this appeals process. There's all these post-conviction processes that take place throughout the conviction. So when we went back to court, Ronald Cotton had come up with a theory that not only was he innocent, but there was a man in the same prison, in the same dorm, working in the same kitchen that was confessing to the crimes. So under voir dire, they brought this man into the courtroom in November of 1987, and he categorically denied having made any of these confessions. So that was the end of that. Both the second survivor and myself pointed at Ronald Cotton, and again, Ronald was found guilty again, this time to 2 life sentences. And then once again, people tell you now you really can move on, right? This is really behind you now. And so you begin to pick up the pieces again. Every time these things happen, your life gets shattered. And every time your life is shattered, there's just more pieces of you that get lost and you're fragmented. So I was able to get married and have children. And then in 1995, in the spring, I received a phone call from the original investigator of the case, Mike Galden, who was now captain, and the ADA of Alamance County telling me they needed to come visit me. And that's all I knew. They were coming to visit me, which I thought was quite a lovely thing after 11 years. How nice that they, want to know about my life. So they came to my house and then told me about this thing called post-conviction DNA testing. And I remember thinking that, wait, this is over. This is over. He's in prison. Like now what are we doing? And of course, the theory was that, of course, he's lying and the DNA test is going to show it and I shouldn't have to worry about it. That it's just kind of an attempt on his part to throw more smoke up. So I gave them the blood that afternoon because my blood sample from the rape kit from 11 years ago had disintegrated, and off it went to the lab. And honestly, I didn't think too much about it. It was March, and I thought, well, they're going to run the test. It's going to point to Ronald Cotton, and now we'll really be done. My children are 5. This is extremely traumatic. I don't want to continue to relive this. And then 3 months later, they came back to my house and told me that the DNA test not only had shown that it was indeed not Ronald Cotton, but it was in fact Bobby Poole, the man from the 1987 second trial. And, people often ask me about that moment. What was that like? And I have very little memory of it other than feeling like I was swallowed down into the bowels of hell. Because I didn't understand how this could have happened. First of all, you don't understand. And then you're not sure what's next. And for me, the only thing that I knew that was next was he was going to be released out of prison. And that was kind of it. He's going to be released, and then what do I do? And am I safe? Are my children safe? Will people, want to hurt me? Will people want to hurt my children? And while I will always be grateful that Mike Galden and the ADA came to my house and called me beforehand and gave me the news personally, it would take me way over 2 decades to begin unpacking what the wrongful conviction had done to my life and to my family's life. And the fact that there was nothing in place for me. There was no one offered me any services. There was no victim's advocate, which I never even knew existed in the courts. And because I was never offered one at the beginning, I certainly wasn't offered one now. But it was a very scary time. And it was probably the hardest moment of the journey, was trying to figure out how to talk about that part of my harm. I could easily talk about the rape and I could talk about the trial, but it was really difficult to talk about that post-conviction phase because my harm was put in a category of not very important, because the world only wanted to know about Ronald Cotton and what had happened to him in those 11 years that he had lost. And so the narrative given to me was, not only was I fine, and not only was I not hurt, but I was to blame for what had happened to Ronald Cotton. And that narrative and that assigning blame to me was unbelievably destructive. And that led me to the next part, which was the founding of Healing Justice and trying to create a space where we could create equity and narrative and understand that the experiences from crime survivors was so painful and so traumatic, and there was no place for their narrative in the stories of a wrongful conviction.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a very powerful, very moving and difficult story. And we really appreciate you willing to share it, with the IAP team and obviously everyone who's watching today and who's going to be watching the recording, that we put online. Curious to know, when you say the narrative that was put out there to make you feel, like you were the less important piece of the story and that you might even been to blame. Was it the media? Who was making you feel that way after the exoneration became public?
I mean, the media had a lot. They have a lot to be blamed for. Yes, I mean, the narrative was truly white rape survivor falsely accuses and sends an innocent Black man to prison not once but twice. That was the narrative for 20 years. And I didn't know that that was false. No one told me that this had not only wasn't my fault, but could never have been my fault. As a matter of fact, the very first person that really helped me understand that was Katie Monroe. She was the first person who really sat down with me and said, you were harmed as well in the wrongful conviction. And because it had been so long and I had bought into really the lies, it was very difficult for me to kind of switch my thinking over to the fact that you're right, I can't be responsible for what happened because I didn't create the suspect list. I didn't create the photographic lineup. I didn't pick out the jurors. Those things were not in my power. The only thing that I knew that had happened to me was I was raped and I survived. And then of course you want to help the police. Of course you want the person to go to prison. I mean, of course you do.
Right.
But the narrative through the media was that it was my fault, that I had done this to Ronald Cotton all by myself, single-handedly. And it has taken me a very long time to realize that not only can it not be my fault, but that the person responsible for all of it was Bobby Poole. And I will tell you that in all the presentations I do, which have been thousands of presentations, not a single person in the audience has ever stood up and looked at me and said, wow, man, Bobby Poole did so much damage to you and to Ronald Cotton. It is always, regardless of how often I tell this story, of, man, you must feel so guilty for what you did to Ronald Cotton. And I still shake my head and think, but wait, like Bobby Poole did this to me and Bobby Poole did this to Ronald. And then the criminal justice system failed everybody.
And I think that's why, one of the many reasons why healing justice is so important is that now, thankfully, because of the organization that you started and that Katie is running, there's now a place for survivors and family members of survivors like Andrea to go to and find that community and be told that it's not your fault and none of this was your fault. And you've actually been now victims, not once, but twice. I'd like to turn to Andrea. Your story is really similar to Jennifer's in the sense that you went through an exoneration, but of course it's different because you're a family member of the victim. And your mother, for the audience, Jacqueline Harrison, was brutally tortured, raped, and killed. And then you learned many years later that the person sentenced for your mother's death was exonerated. So similar to Jennifer, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your story and what the exoneration process was like for you.
Well, thank you guys for having me and allowing me to share my mother's story and mine and my sister's journey, as well as my family's journey beyond the yellow tape. On August 24th, 1987, I was probably I was 3 years old, almost 4, right? But my mother, unfortunately, was brutally raped, tortured, and like you said, subsequently murdered on that morning. And yes, Mr. Peterson was originally convicted and sentenced for the murder of my mother after the trial had concluded. And for us, just like Jennifer described, after something traumatic like that, we did what everyone tries to do under similar circumstances, which is move on and be normal, because in our eyes, the bad guy had, gotten caught or whatever the case was, and that there was nothing that we needed to do other than, work within ourselves to try to heal from the trauma that we had experienced. And, me and my sister learned what a new normal is for, daughters who are now missing their mother. And that could have been the end of our story. We could have moved on and healed and grew the best way we could. But there was a phone call in the spring, summer of 2005, I believe it was. My grandmother got a call from my aunt. My aunt had gotten a call from the Burlington County Prosecutor's office, and they were informing us that the entire family needed to, or that it was suggested that the entire family meet up with the prosecutor's office in New Jersey, because of course we had moved from New Jersey since then, to talk about my mother's case, because there were some things happening that we were just now being told about. And we were told initially that Mr. Peterson was being released from prison because there was some evidence that was going to be presented in an exoneration case. And of course, for us, we had no idea what an exoneration was. And in that moment, it wasn't necessarily, or it wasn't clearly explained to us what the exoneration process was and what was going to be happening. All we were told was that he was going to be released because of some evidence, some DNA evidence. Mitochondrial DNA was found not to have matched his own. And that was one of the things that was originally part of his conviction. And so they promised us that they would retry him again, not for us to worry, you know, they'll keep us informed on when the proceedings happen, and then we could come back. What happened was Mr. Peterson was released, and unfortunately, he was not retried again because of other evidence they could not recall, and the generation of the rape kit and the DNA that was left there, as well as witnesses who were no longer able to be considered credible in order to help prove the prosecutor's case against Mr. Peterson. And for us, we were like, wait, so what happens to my mother? Because now that means her murder is unsolved, and this mystery DNA is not pointing to anyone. What exactly is going to happen? Is there going to be another investigation to figure out who exactly did this? So now that, because now we've gotten all re-traumatized all over again, you know, now we're anxious and, you know, worried because we don't know who the person is that hurt her. And if that person is still alive after so many years later, they could still be out there. And if they understand that Mr. Peterson is now exonerated and that the family is looking for justice to settle my mother's case, maybe they might be after us. We don't know who this person is. Who should we stay away from? All those things come flooding back, you know, and for us, or for me, it's more like, it's a terrible thing to think about a life that goes unnoticed. And within these exoneration proceedings, similar to Jennifer's experience with the media, everything talked about Mr. Peterson and him being the victim of this. But everybody forgot about the original victim, my mother. She perished during this, you know. Thankfully, Jennifer, you are still here to share your story and your experience so that it can better help, you know, people in the justice system, law enforcement, and victims advocates so that we can do better. But as far as my mother is concerned, what about her? You know, what happens to her? And right now we're still looking for justice for Jackie. That's my stance right here. So I enjoy being in these kinds of conversations, because one of the biggest things that are forgotten are the people that actually perish when the people who are exonerated are still alive and they can continue to live on. But the families who suffer the trauma over again after losing a loved one and then going through these exonerations, it's even harder because we still don't have anything to hold on to. Where's our hope? You know, and that's been our experience for the brunt of it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I can see how heartbreaking that must have been for you to have to relive it again, you know, so many years later. You know, Katie, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what Healing Justice does. I mean, we know that you work with, you know, with survivors like Jennifer and Andrea and so many others, but tell us a little bit about Healing Justice's work that I wasn't able to go into briefly in the introduction.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, and to the IIP for having us. And thank you to Andrea and Jennifer for sharing your stories. Every time I listen to you both, I'm in awe of your courage and your tremendous leadership, and I'm grateful. So thank you. As you know, Healing Justice was founded by Jennifer and predominantly on her personal experience, but not just her personal experience with an exoneration, but also her personal experience engaging in restorative justice and healing, not just with Ronald Cotton, but also with the police and prosecutor in that case. And at Healing Justice, that part of our success, or maybe really all of our success, has been based on Jennifer's vision of engaging all of the individuals who are harmed in these cases. And it's not just, as you know, the exonerated person and his or her family, but they're also the original victim, the person who was hurt in the first instance, and their family. But we also know that police, prosecutors, judges, other attorneys, jurors are all impacted as well. There is some degree of harm that is left with everyone who is involved in the case. And so the overarching mission of Healing Justice is to address that, is to address how everyone gets impacted, how everyone gets harmed, and to bring those individuals together into the same space to bear witness to each other's harm, to validate that harm, and to heal together. And we've found tremendous success in that model. And really the cornerstone of our work has been that group healing or those group healing activities, but we've also now evolved to offer individual support in the way of peer support and access to specialized service providers between or to supplement those group activities. And of course, we do a tremendous amount of justice reform work, which is, training and technical assistance for practitioners in the field, mostly aimed at, as Jennifer said, increasing equity and empathy for crime victims and survivors to make sure that they're not lost and forgotten, and frankly, the last to know what is happening in the post-conviction space. I think for Jennifer and probably Andrea and me, all of us working with Healing Justice, I think we've been surprised to discover just how forgotten crime victims and survivors are. I mean, of course, we work directly with a number of victims and survivors from around the country, but to say that every conversation we have with practitioners in the field, or almost every one, involves some surprise on their part that crime victims and survivors matter as well, and that they've been forgotten is a vast understatement. I mean, really, we almost everyone says to us, "Oh boy, I forgot." Right? I forgot that victims and survivors are impacted in the post-conviction space. I forgot that they need information. I forgot that they need access to continuing care and services. And this is where we think prosecutors play such a unique and important role, in part because of their unique duty to victims and survivors, starting from the very beginning of the case, right? Well before the trial or the conviction, but also because the unique relationship. Most victims and survivors with whom we work speak very directly about their reliance on prosecutors, right? I mean, they come to rely on them to be the deliverers of information and the connectors to support and services. And so this audience that we're engaged with today, which is really exciting for us and a tremendous honor, we really think that you all are in the best position to make sure that victims and survivors don't get forgotten in the post-conviction space, and to make sure that you stay connected to them so they know what's going on. They're not the last to know. They don't learn the news from third parties, and that they stay connected to service providers and get that support that they need. And I look forward to telling you a little bit more about some very specific work that we've done in that area and new tools and resources that are available to you all.
Thank you. You mentioned something, Katie, about the healing group exercises that you do. And have there been instances where you're including, say, a survivor, an exoneree, and the prosecutor in the case all at the same time? Or maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what those meetings look like.
Absolutely. And these meetings were actually designed by Jennifer working in concert with an innocence organization and a very renowned international restorative justice practitioner who and together they thought very intentionally about what restorative justice would look like in the wake of a wrongful conviction and exoneration. And they designed a process for these cases specifically. So far, we've only had been able to bring into any one space crime victims and survivors, their families, exonerated individuals and their families, sometimes from the same cases, sometimes not. But we have not been able to get a police officer or a prosecutor or a juror in the room yet, but that is our goal. One of the things that we started with and continue to do is something we call listening sessions, where we strive to better understand what exactly the nature of the impact was to, say, a particular group of people, and what were their needs then and what are their needs now. And something we're working on is listening sessions for prosecutors, listening sessions for police and judges and jurors, so that we better understand what the impact of the wrongful conviction and exoneration was on them. And I think that will enable us then to bring them into these group settings with a sense of safety for them and for the others in the room. But it's a goal of ours.
Yes, no, it's an amazing goal, and I'm confident one day you'll be able to make it happen. But I also see how that can be difficult and challenging. Andrea and Jennifer, what would have been the most helpful thing from you to hear from the prosecution or police officers when you learned the news of the exoneration? Jennifer, I know you mentioned that it would have been helpful for someone to make clear to you that it was not your fault at all. But maybe if there are any other tips you have for prosecutors watching this who may have to deliver this kind of news to a survivor, that would be helpful. But we'll start with Andrea, since Jennifer, you already touched on it a little bit in your answer.
So for us, when we heard about the exoneration, what I would have preferred, or what would have been preferred, at least for my family, is an explanation of what was going on. Very simply, it's easy to help someone get on board, if you will, or married to this process if they understand what's happening. And I think that prosecutors and detectives and things need to put themselves in the victim's shoes or in the family member's shoes for a second when they are presenting things like this. Think about the frenzy, the anxiety that one must go through to understand that something is about to happen that is totally unexpected. And for my mother's case in particular, Mr. Peterson had been seeking or had been sharing these claims of innocence, of course, since the original trial, but he had been actively pursuing and getting support from the Innocence Project. And we were not even, it was not shared with us that was going on. And for us, it would have been preferred that if this were the case, someone should have notified us that, hey, Mr. Peterson is seeking help from the Innocence Network in order to prove his innocence. And we want you to understand that if something were to happen, then there could be an exoneration. This is what an exoneration means. And this is what might happen for your family. Of course, we know that things may not happen in one particular way for everybody's case, or it may not be a hard and fast rule on the time frames and all of that thing. But to understand that, one, something was actually happening with my mother's case because we were oblivious would have been helpful, and it may have allowed us to ease into the situation and not be so anxious about what was happening. I know for me, though I had moved from New Jersey, my father still lives in New Jersey. And so I go back to visit him and other family members often. As soon as I was told about this exoneration, and after we met with the prosecutor's office and they were sharing with us that Mr. Peterson could be released, and then they told us he was being released, guess who decided they weren't going to visit New Jersey for a little while? Because as a little girl, that trauma replayed in my mind that someone hurt my mommy, because that 3-year-old imprint is all I had in my mind. And I can still remember the last day I saw my mother. It was the Friday before she was murdered. I remember waving to her and I remember her face, yet I still cannot recall her voice, because during her torture and murder, her voice box was crushed. A stick was forced down her throat. And so for us, when she lost her voice, and years later, we were now given an opportunity, and I use my voice to talk about our experience and how we want to be engaged, because it directly impacts me, especially since the person has not been found. And for us, as far as the media and notification is concerned, you take away my voice once again when you don't tell me what's happening. You take away my ability to understand and be more cooperative in the process. If I don't know what's happening, then you're going to get an anxious person. You're going to get a frenzied person, because they're reliving a trauma, right? And they don't really know what's happening. So it's like me with my children. I let them know what's happening. When something new is happening, I let them know, okay, this is what's going on. that's the same thing any victim would appreciate, because not knowing is what stirs you up even more. And I think for us, the earlier we could be notified about what is happening and exactly what it entails, even if you can't tell me it's going to happen in 2 months or 7 years, knowing that this is a potential, this is how this works, that helps us better process. And for our family, because we were not living in New Jersey, we had to come back and forth. We had to travel there. So not knowing and then being called on the drop of a dime to have to travel, it's even harder for us. So not only are we reliving the trauma, but now I have to, navigate my work situations and navigate other family situations. So knowing ahead of time, that's the first thing, knowing as early as possible would be the first thing, or my first challenge that we faced. And then similar to Jennifer, and how the media is portraying or pointing, the finger, a lot of the media talked about, Mr. Peterson being a victim and everybody rallying behind him. And that, should be the case. If someone is innocent, of course, they should be rallied behind, and they should be supported, as they restart their life. But also think about the families that are impacted, because the language that is used when we talk about those that are being released from this, you also have to think about how that impacts the family members of the original victim. And again, like I said, my mother was murdered. It wasn't like she's still here to defend herself or even share her thoughts and feelings. We're reliving that for her. So being cognizant of how that might impact family members, especially people like me. I was a kid, thinking about that really makes a difference. Even in the original case, looking back at some of the headlines, it's just terrible how things are shaped in order to skew an audience in such a way that you want them to believe, instead of just plainly stating the facts. This woman was murdered. This is the person we thought. This is not the person. Now we need support in finding out who the real person is. Just like Mr. Peterson needed support and getting his life back together, so did we. And we didn't get that.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that makes sense, that prosecutors can always do more to communicate with their victims, whether it's pre-trial or post-trial phase of a case. Jennifer, did you have anything you wanted to add as far as something that you could have been told, or timing of, notifications that something's happening in the case? I mean, obviously you were notified multiple times throughout, but anything perhaps in the way the message was delivered?
Yeah, I mean, Andrea did a wonderful job explaining about the notification. And at Healing Justice, what we do know from talking to our crime survivors and murder victim family members is that the earlier someone is notified in a way that creates agency for us. So the idea of letting us decide where we're going to be notified, how we're going to be notified, how often we want information coming into us is critically important, because the crime in and of itself, whether you are a rape survivor or a murder victim family member, creates the removal of our agency and our power. We didn't have power or agency to stop what was happening to us or our family members. And when the system comes in and decides what's best for us, it's very, very traumatizing. When someone says, well, we won't notify them until a few days before because we don't want to create any more trauma, that is taking away my power to control. And we know by talking to every single one of our survivors that the earlier they're notified, the better it is for us, and the better it is for the entire process. Like, we know this to be true. But I think the other part that was important for me, which, this happened, the exoneration happened in 1995. So we really weren't talking about wrongful convictions that much. Our case was the 23rd, 24th case in the whole country. So not only were we not talking about wrongful convictions in any meaningful way, we sure weren't talking about the experiences of the crime survivors. And so part of the harm that was created in my case, and I always go back to this, is the media and how I wasn't protected from the media. And again, Andrea talks about the language used. It's so important. I mean, we have so many of our murder victim family members that the language surrounding their death was promiscuity, party girl, drug addict, prostitute, alcohol, whatever it is, as if somehow that created their own murder. That just by the fact that they were, using drugs, or whether they had gone to a party or whatever it is, created it, they are also responsible for their own death. So while I was responsible for Ronald's incarceration, according to the media, a lot of our murder victim family members, the language was that they participated in their own death. And we have a case that we've worked with where the family members, it was a murder, in North Carolina, were eligible for compensation for burial and funeral services. But because the language and the media had framed her as a prostitute, the family was told that they didn't qualify for any victim services because their family member, their loved one, had been responsible for her own murder. And so all of those things that we talk about, language, equity, notification and timing, and being respectful, and being trauma informed, are so important to the experiences in this post-conviction process. And the other thing for me that I think would have been really important is to have been told at the very beginning in 1985 what is going to happen next. I didn't have any guidelines. I didn't have any information. So I didn't know that you automatically come up for appeal. Like, no one told me that. And the fact that Ronald and his lawyers were working on this DNA test for 2 years prior to me being informed. So I wasn't informed until March of '95, but they had been working on this since 1993. And I was, and in the lifetime, in the sequence of these processes, I had 3 months, which kind of like in dog years looks like about, forever, because most of our folks are told a day before, a few hours before, the following day, or in one of our cases, 10 years later, the family finds out that the person who had murdered their loved one was exonerated 10 years ago, and no one bothered to tell them.
Thank you for sharing that guidance. And, I imagine a lot of this is going to have overlap with my next question for Katie, but, what have you at Healing Justice, Katie, been trying to advocate among prosecutors so that, current and future survivors or family members have a much better experience than Jennifer and Andrea might have had?
Sure. No, thank you for the question. And Andrea and Jennifer have done such a good job about laying out, not only do we need to improve the way that we engage and support crime victims and survivors in the post-conviction setting, but there do need to be guidelines, right? Prosecutors should do better, and they can do better, and we're confident that you will. One of the things that was very exciting in our work is that we got a 2-year grant from the Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime. And that grant was focused on understanding the experiences and needs of crime victims and survivors in post-conviction exoneration cases. But everything we learned as a result of that 2-year project, and the resources and tools that were eventually released as the result of the project, apply in the whole post-conviction setting. They're not limited to cases involving exonerations and post-conviction exonerations and claims of innocence. And something Jennifer said that I just want to hit on, which is this really all has to start pre-trial. I know a lot of people in the audience are prosecutors who might not work in the post-conviction setting, but that information that needs to be imparted, and that the beginning of that continuum of care, that all starts pre-trial, continues through the trial, and then of course for the whole life of the case, which is essentially the entire time that the person who has been convicted and sentenced is serving in prison. So there's this idea somehow that it all ends for crime victims and survivors after there's conviction, but in fact, especially in cases involving violent crimes, the case can last for many, many years, if not decades. And so we need to, as prosecutors, we want to be thinking about that even before a conviction is secured. How am I going to make sure that victims and survivors have a continuum of care and are not forgotten and left behind and the last to know? They should never be the last to know that there is continuing activity or renewed activity in their cases post-conviction. So this grant project that we had was really terrific. It was guided by a multidisciplinary committee of practitioners and survivors. We had prosecutors, we had police, we had researchers, and of course we had original victims and victim advocates. And we did two really important things as part of the project, and that was to try and learn from the field. So we spent time listening to crime victims and survivors so that we understood their experience. And then we surveyed the field, prosecutors, police, victim advocates in the post-conviction space to understand, what was going on out there that could serve as a model and what was going on out there that needed to be improved. And you can find, we released a wealth of very, very unique and practical tools and resources, and they're available at a website called survivorservices.org. survivorservices.org. So I really encourage you to check those out. There are documentary films, there are model policies, there are informational packets that can be adapted by your agency and given to victims and survivors. And of course, we at Healing Justice are available to do technical assistance around any case or situation you may have. But all of the tools and resources are guided by a set of overarching guidelines. And I just want to highlight a few. There are actually 8, but I'll highlight a few. And I know we've been saying this since the beginning, but establishing contact early is the #1 guideline. And that is because, it's because of a lot of things, but one, victims should not be the last to know what is happening in their case. That is the #1 thing that causes them trauma in the post-conviction setting. It isn't getting information, it's not getting information, just as Andrea described. You also, as prosecutors, don't want that information coming from a third party, right? In cases in which we've worked, most people get information about their post-conviction case from either a defense attorney's investigator, or the media. And that robs prosecutors of an opportunity to make sure that that good, objective legal information is being passed on, and that those people are being connected to victim services, because no one else out there, the media and the innocence organizations, the defense organizations, their obligation is to the prisoner claiming innocence. They're not in a position to make sure that victim services are provided. And so that is the prosecutor's responsibility. So you want to make sure that you get in there and establish that contact early. And then you want to make sure that you provide that choice that Jennifer described, which is giving them that power and that agency to decide how much information they want, when do they want it, and from whom. Some victims and survivors are going to say, look, I don't need to hear anything until the bitter end. But many are going to say, I need to know everything along the way, and they deserve that. And there's also other guidelines that I really want to encourage you to look at. But one of the things I want to drive home is that there's a victims' rights piece in here that actually applies. One of the things we learned during our project is that victims' rights extends to the post-conviction setting, whether somebody is seeking parole or seeking a resentencing or being transferred to a new prison or challenging their convictions. Victims' rights apply. And so when you don't provide notification, you actually are robbing victims and survivors of their ability to exercise their rights to be heard, their rights to privacy and confidentiality, their rights to being treated with respect and fairness and dignity. These rights are codified in at least half of state constitutions around the country. And also there are statutes that govern or require explicit notification in post-conviction settings. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that I don't think any of this should be being done because it's required by rights or statutes. I think it should be being done because we owe it to victims and survivors. We ask victims and survivors to participate in our criminal justice system in order to protect public safety, in order to protect the innocent. And if we ask them to participate in the system, then we owe them a duty of care and respect and fairness and equity and empathy. And not only that, when we fail to engage them, and Andrea and Jennifer talked about this as well, we lose them. We alienate them from the criminal justice process. They no longer trust the process. They no longer trust us as practitioners. We lose them. in the ability to continue protecting public safety and protecting the innocent. But we also, I think, lose them as critical allies in conversations around criminal justice reform. There are so many conversations about criminal justice reform happening these days, especially around post-conviction reform, whether it's reentry or resentencing or mass incarceration, whatever it may be, and we lose victims and survivors as allies in those conversations. And so my hope would be that the sense of duty and care that you provide isn't attached to statutes and rights, that it's attached to your understanding that as a prosecutor, you have a very special place, a very special role in the lives of victims and survivors, and that you'll do it because it's the right thing to do.
I think, yeah, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but one of the things that's most striking is, some people might want to be notified very early. Some people might not want to be notified at all. But what I'm gathering, and correct me if I'm wrong, from what you all are saying, is the important thing is to reach out early the first time, and then perhaps at that moment ask them, how often do you want to be notified? Do you not want to hear from me until the person is ultimately exonerated, or do you want weekly updates, right? And so it sounds like that's sort of what Jennifer was talking about giving agency to the survivor and not assuming that, what's best or what might be best for that particular person. Anybody, want to add to that, or Andrea or Jennifer, did you want to add anything to what Katie just said about healing justice's principles?
Just one little tidbit, and I appreciate you allowing that. I mean, for like Jennifer and like Katie shared, for any victim, especially like me and my sister, it's incredibly painful to teach somebody about your trauma, to talk about it and recount it, but explain why it matters. That hurts a little bit more than the other two, but it's important because we're sharing our experience of what we've been through. And sometimes when you're a practitioner, you're not viewing it from that lens. So hearing someone's experience can help you better understand where you might have had a shortcoming, or somewhere where you might be able to change the process, or see where some processes can be updated in order to reflect better care and treatment and respect, like Katie mentioned, for victims and their families, because otherwise the system disparities and gaps in support for victims is never going to be recognized. So that it's very important.
Thank you. Jennifer, I wasn't sure if you wanted to add, but
no, I mean, I think Katie and Andrea have done a really good job, but one of the ways we try to help people understand why it's so important to notify victims and survivors early in the process. And we continue to hear this kind of pushback, but we don't want to re-traumatize them if indeed the DNA test comes back and shows that the person is in fact guilty. And I will tell you that as a survivor, it doesn't matter either way. Like, I want to know as early as possible what's going on. And we try to equate this with your medical health. I mean, if someone's testing you for some type of a disease, but we're not going to tell you what's going on during the process unless it does in fact lead to a disease, that's really traumatizing for you. You're sitting there wondering, someone's taken away the ability for you to decide how often and where and when you want to be notified. And so again, I go back to this agency. It's not appropriate for someone to decide for me when I should be notified about something within my own case. I may tell you, when you notify me, don't ever talk to me again, but that's my agency. That's me having the power to say, please don't call me again. But more often than not, we're going to probably want to be notified, and we're going to want to participate.
And Alyssa, I'd just like to add, this doesn't have to fall on prosecutors alone. One of the 8 guidelines is collaborating with other agencies that are engaged either in post-conviction process or victim advocacy. So, prosecutors would play a lead role in making sure that notification happens, making sure that objective, truthful legal information, to the degree that it can be passed on, is passed on. And of course, if you can't pass something on, you just say, I can't share that, or can't answer that, but here's what we do know. But there are victim advocates, either in your agencies or in post-conviction agencies. In fact, there are many departments of corrections around the country that have really robust victim services departments who provide aid around probation and parole and release. They are resources to you. There are community-based victim advocacy organizations that you can engage to make sure that there is, access to support and services. So it's not like all of this falls on you as a prosecutor or on your agency. You collaborate and create a team that makes sure that no survivors and victims are falling through the cracks.
Thank you. And you provide me a nice segue, because we're getting some questions from the audience that appear to be in the defense world or in the Innocence Project world. And perhaps, Katie, maybe you have some thoughts as someone who used to do that work. And so some of the questions touch on, let's say you have a situation where prosecutors are not reaching out to the victim. How can an innocence attorney balance wanting to inform the victim or the survivor or the survivor's family early, but not wanting to re-traumatize them? And how can they communicate with them and help them encourage them to understand the full process in case they don't want to believe that there might have been a wrongful conviction? So any thoughts you have? We can open up to everybody, but we'll start with you, Katie, on ways that attorneys who are bringing the claim for an incarcerated person can approach a survivor or their family.
Sure, thank you. No, it's an important question, and I guess it comes with a caveat, and I think it really depends on whether or not it can be delivered without an agenda. As a former innocence lawyer and continuing to work with innocence organizations around the country, the reality is, as innocence organizations or defense attorneys, we're usually reaching out to victims and survivors, not to make sure that they are provided notification and can exercise their rights, but because we want information from them, right? They have evidentiary value. And we see this particularly in cases involving sexual assault and victim eyewitness identification. And so I think maybe the most important thing is to pause and understand why it is that you're doing that outreach. And if that outreach is investigatory in nature and aims to serve the purposes of your client, which is fine, then it has to still be done in a way that is victim-centered, right? And then all of the same guidelines would apply, which is, you have to be respectful and trauma-informed, and that outreach has to provide agency and choice. And it can't come with demands or expectations or a timeline or an agenda. We do work with innocence organizations to help design that outreach if we feel like it really is intended to be victim-centered and trauma-informed. But again, I just think it's important to pause and make sure that that you're really prepared to do it in a way that doesn't hurt victims and survivors, because we understand that you have an obligation to your client. I know that in the past, many innocence organizations have tried to, to work with the prosecutor's office to do that outreach. And I think that that's still a good guidance is, see if there's somebody in the prosecutor's office who's willing to do that for you, or do that to make sure that there's no surprise there. But otherwise, I would encourage you to reach out to us and we can help with that. And if a survivor says they don't want to talk to you, or they're not interested in hearing from you, or they need time, then you have to honor that. And so you have to be prepared to honor that when you do that first outreach. And I really would love Jennifer and Andrea to talk about what that would feel like and look like to them if that first outreach did not come from somebody within the system, if it came from the prisoner's representation.
I think that if the initial outreach had come from somebody working on behalf of Ronald Cotton, I probably would not have had a very good response. I trusted Mike Galden. I had known him from the beginning. He was the first investigator that I talked to the night of my rape. He had always treated me with a great deal of respect and compassion. So when he came to my house, I trusted whatever came from him, and I knew that he wasn't going to try to do anything that harmed me. Later, of course, down the road, I met Ronald's attorneys, and they're very close friends of mine now. But I think if that initial outreach had come from them, I don't think that they would have had a very warm reception from me.
Andrea, did you have any interaction with Mr. Peterson's attorneys?
I did not have interactions with them. We talked only with the prosecutor's office, the detectives that were working on the case, and there was one victim advocate that was there. Like Jennifer, had I been contacted by Mr. Peterson's persons, I probably would have not had the best, it wouldn't have been as pleasant a conversation. It wouldn't have been as welcoming, because I would have been, one, taken back, but two, I would have been looking for their intention. Their intent would have made the difference on how I spoke with them, and to get that before I got anything from anyone else that should be on quote unquote my side, I definitely probably wouldn't have had the best disposition. And my commentary probably would have been about not contacting me until, I could be better supported from, the prosecutor's side, or my family rather.
Thank you, Andrea. One area that we've touched on a lot is the media. And, I think prosecutors can learn a lot from what you all are recommending and from Healing Justice's guidance and materials that it has on its website. But what can prosecutors do to help survivors or survivors' family members navigate the media, since obviously the media is outside of the control of the prosecution? And related to that, is there anything you think that prosecutors should communicate to the media to protect survivors and make what's already a very re-traumatizing event less harmful?
We did, we had a specific case coming out of Brooklyn several years ago where both sides contacted us. It was an innocence lawyer, and it was someone from a prosecutor's office contacted us to try to understand what was the best way to move forward with the crime survivor in this case. And I worked on this particular case for probably about a year prior to the actual exoneration of this particular individual. And one of the things that I was strongly recommending was to help the media, to kind of like start with the media in announcing that, yes, this is indeed a wrongful conviction case. And both sides, by the way, were saying this. Yes, this is indeed a wrongful conviction case, and in no way was she responsible for this at all. So that both of them had the same language of saying, using this non-blaming language as they began to talk about the case, which really helped the crime survivor. And we do have resources that are on the link that Katie shared. So there's several, Katie calls them buckets. And one of the buckets is media and how to talk to the media and reach out to the media, and for media to actually also use these particular resources as well. But there's just certain language, certain words that should just never, ever be used. And a lot of that Andrea touched on. Just how do we talk about the crime survivor? And in rape cases, to make sure that if someone provided an eyewitness identification, that it's not my fault that I was led through a flawed procedure. So it's using words such as Jennifer Thompson having been led through a flawed procedure, so that it takes the blame off of me, because that's important. It's important for me. It's important for the general population who simply don't understand memory and trauma.
Thank you. One question I have for all of you also is, a lot of our audience, as Katie mentioned, includes a lot of line prosecutors. So prosecutors who don't directly handle exonerations, or they don't even handle the appeals in their offices. And so what would you say to someone who's a trial prosecutor who usually doesn't handle the post-conviction motions, and as far as their work is concerned, not as far as how they're concerned, but as far as their work is concerned, once there's a guilty plea or once there's a trial with a conviction, the case is really for them and their work, the case is over. And so what would you tell those prosecutors and how they should potentially prepare a survivor for a successful appeal, however unlikely, or an exoneration? You know, obviously recognizing that these exonerations, although they are increasing in number, they don't happen very often. So I don't know if you think, Katie, you unmuted yourself, so I'll let you go first.
I think we hit on this a little bit earlier, but that information about the fact that there is going to be a post-conviction life to the case needs to be provided by you, right? You have to be preparing victims and survivors that the conviction that comes with the plea or the trial is not going to be at the end. At some point there will be release, or if there's not release, there may be parole, or if there isn't parole, there may be other, there will be direct appeals, there will be other challenges to convictions. And it's there are some really wonderful lawyers at the National Crime Victims Law Institute who have been, who are already starting to think about this and work on this. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's one that still has to be had. You can't leave victims and survivors in the dark to discover after the trial or conviction that things are going to continue to happen for years. So that conversation needs to start, you know, with your office. And then I think that making sure that whatever victim advocacy, victim witness, victim survivor, services support that you've been providing is connected up in the next agency. So for example, in some states like Virginia, the Attorney General's office handles all of the post-conviction filings, and it has a victim witness office. In fact, there's a really robust victim services department in the Department of Corrections there that handles kind of everything in the post-conviction space. So making sure that a survivor, you know, that your survivor is being handed, for lack of a better term, from your office to the next agency that will be handling the case. And then as the case then, you know, goes into the parole, probation, release space to those victim advocates in the departments of corrections. And I say this not just because survivors and victims need it, but your victim advocates need it. When we did our survey of practitioners across the country, we discovered countless victim advocates from prosecutors' offices who were still shepherding victims and survivors through the post-conviction service, even though it wasn't their job and they weren't trained in it, because they had developed these relationships, and victims and survivors were calling back to those original victim advocates from the, you know, from the line prosecutor offices to say, what's going on? You know, why is this still happening? Where do I turn for help? And so they were holding their hands just out of charity and empathy, even though it wasn't their jobs. And so we just, as prosecutors, you're the starting place for that continuum of care and information and support. And then you may need to make sure that it gets passed on to the next agency and to the next agency. And and not every jurisdiction is going to have the best resources to do that, but there are places that you can reach out to get help with that. And one of those places would be Healing Justice. We can help you with that too.
Thank you, Jennifer. Andrea, any thoughts? I mean, Andrea, I know you were 3 years old when this happened, so you obviously didn't have any interaction with the trial attorney, but perhaps you have thoughts, you know, if you had been older, or Jennifer, if you have thoughts, perhaps experiences that you've been learning about through Healing Justice's activities, anything you want to add to what Katie said. And Andrea, we'll start with you.
No, I agree with what Katie said, honestly. For me, because I was so young then, my voice wasn't considered, right? And I love using this whole voice thing because, again, my mother's voice was taken away. So now I take on that for her. And just telling me, like Katie just explained, just explaining that this isn't the end, because those of us who are not within the justice system and don't serve in any of those kinds of roles, you could have popped me with a pin when I was told that, hey, something can happen after someone's convicted. I had no idea that that was a thing. And I think that lots of victims and their family members are not aware that, you know, or fully aware of the extent of what could happen after someone is convicted or is not convicted, for that matter. And even now with exonerations, what happens after that. So not knowing is the biggest challenge. So helping those who now have to be a part of this process know and understand, I mean, that's the biggest ask I could ever have. just tell me what's going on. Information is so powerful. And I think that the more I know as a victim, because I am, you know, my mother was murdered. She was taken from me. And so my family suffered that trauma, and I still continue to deal with that today. And it's been 34 years since my mother was killed. And so knowing helps people better process and understand. And then I can decide, like Jennifer has shared, that I have that agency to say I want to be involved or not involved. So just tell me up front and let me know that this can happen, this may happen. And that's better than not knowing and then being surprised and saying, hey, somebody called and now things are changing with the case. You know, it's better to know up front, even if nothing ever happened.
Thank you. So I don't know if it's just on my end or if Andrea has frozen. Here we go.
I'm not
See if
sure
we can get her back.
Yeah, I'm not sure if she froze or not, but I'll go ahead and just add, you know, my 2 cents into this. And again, it's a lot of reiteration of what I've already said, but, you know, if you think about what a crime survivor has experienced after the initial trauma, and then to be left with no other information. And so we use, you know, the word for crime survivors, and I don't like it, by the way, but we use this word of closure. You know, now that this is over, you can seek some closure. And we need to stop using that word, by the way, because Andrea and I will tell you, there is no closure. There's just different detours and directions that we're taking on. But the reality is, without information and truth and transparency throughout the process, there is no way that I can possibly begin my healing journey. Like, I can't, because I don't understand what's coming next. And if I don't understand what's coming next, and if you're not delivering that to me in a truthful, transparent, and honest way, then I can't possibly take the next step forward, because I don't know what's the next step forward. And I may step on a landmine, and I don't know how to go forward. And so I think one of the things that crime survivors just ask for is this, like, give me knowledge, give me information, give me truth, give me neutral truth. That's what we're asking for throughout the whole process. And I don't think that's an impossible ask. I think it's easy to do, and it's the right thing to do. And I just recently read something somewhere where if you're not doing the right thing, then you're probably doing the wrong thing. So that's not that hard to think about, right? Like, let's just do the right thing. And that is keeping crime survivors and family members informed as much as they want to be informed. And instead of choosing for us what you think is best for us. And I remember talking to a gentleman a couple of years ago, trying to tell me what was best for crime survivors. And he'd never been a crime survivor. And I got very teary. And I said, you know, you're taking away my right to choose. And the crime took away my right to choose. And you taking that away is not okay. And he got it. He got it.
And then the interesting thing to me, Jennifer, about that story is, even if he had been a crime survivor, not every crime survivor is the same, right? And so I think the biggest takeaway from this presentation and from all of your experiences in your work is to give the survivor some power and agency to decide how often and in what way that person wants to be informed of whether or not there is an exoneration in play, whether or not there is an appeal, you know, whether or not the prosecutor thinks that it's likely to go anywhere. You know, we are a few minutes over. I just want to thank all three of you so much. You know, Andrea and Jennifer, thank you again for sharing your story. They're such powerful and honestly heartbreaking stories to hear. And so the idea that you'd be able to join us and tell it to our audience and let the audience learn from your experiences. And Katie, thank you for leading Healing Justice and doing all that you do to survive, or to help survivors and exonerees who go through these really difficult experiences. So thank you again, both for starting your week on a Monday with this panel presentation. We appreciate it. And for those of you who are watching, we will post the links that Katie mentioned and any other resources that our panelists want us to include. We'll put those up there as well so that you can learn more about healing justice and all of the important work that's happening in this field. For now, thanks again to all three of you. Thank you to our audience for joining and the IIP for helping put this together. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.